very fabric of society, from personal possessions to global trade, is fundamentally shaped by how we answer questions of economic ownership and organization. Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 05, Episode 11, where we unlock Chapter 11 of Andrew Heywood's political theory, an introduction and navigate the intricate landscape of property, the market, and planning. For centuries, politics and economics have been so tightly intertwined, it's often hard to see where one ends and the other begins. This deep dive really strips back complex ideological debates, like capitalism versus socialism, down to their core, asking us to consider these fundamental questions about ownership and economic systems.
That's a fantastic way to frame it. Our mission today is really to understand what property, the market, and planning actually are, why they matter so profoundly to our lives, and to examine their inherent strengths and significant drawbacks. We're going to draw connections that hopefully illuminate how these concepts influence everything from your morning coffee to global supply chains, helping you become, deeply well-informed on this crucial aspect of political theory.
Okay, let's dive right in. When we hear the word property, our minds immediately go to something tangible. A house, a car, maybe a fancy watch, inanimate objects, right? But Heywood really pushes us to look beyond that surface, revealing a much deeper definition.
Absolutely. Property isn't just an object you can touch. It's a social institution. The real insight here is that because it's a social construct defined by custom, convention, and most importantly by law, its meaning isn't fixed. Think of it less as the thing itself and more as an enforceable claim or a right over that object. So picking up a pebble from the beach might give you temporary possession, sure, but it doesn't establish ownership in the legal sense. Ownership means you have rights and powers, but also duties and liabilities, like, the responsibility to conserve or repair something. It's a negotiated relationship.
Wow, that distinction between mere use and actual ownership is so vital, it completely changes how I think about something as simple as, like, picking up a shell on the beach. So it's really about the relationship and the rules, not just the object itself. And this modern notion of property, as we understand it today, really took root during the 17th and 18th centuries. Why then specifically?
Precisely. That's when commercialized economies started booming in the West. Suddenly, objects weren't just objects, they were economic resources, even means of production, or commodities. This made the question of who owned what absolutely vital for exploitation and trade. And it's a stark reminder, too, that even human beings were historically designated as property, most obviously through slavery, but also in some legal systems, wives were regarded as chattels of their husbands. It really underscores how powerful this concept is.
So if property is this fundamental social institution, how does Heywood break down its forms? Because I know he identifies 3 distinct types, each with really radical implications for how economic and social life is organized.
He does. He focuses on private, common, and state property.
Okay, let's start with private property, which is probably what most people automatically think of when they hear the word. C.B. Macpherson defined as the right of an individual or institution to exclude others from the use or benefit of something. How did this concept become the absolute cornerstone of the market and capitalist order?
Well, its justifications are incredibly robust, particularly coming from liberal and conservative thinkers. One of the earliest and most influential arguments comes from 17th century natural rights theorists like John Locke. He believed in self-ownership, that each individual owns their own person, and by extension, the product of their labor. So if you mix your labor with an object, it becomes yours. Later, Robert Nozick, a prominent 20th century philosopher, extended this into his entitlement theory of justice, essentially arguing that if wealth is justly acquired or transferred, then property rights should be strictly upheld. And this places very clear limits on government's ability to regulate or even, tax for redistribution.
That's a fascinating point about self-ownership. So if your labor is mixed with something, it's yours. But what happens when that labor is exploited or when the initial acquisition wasn't strictly just? Does that Lockean ideal still hold up?
Well, that's exactly where the critics come in, yeah. But from the perspective of its proponents, it's really about the sanctity of that original acquisition or just transfer. Beyond natural rights, private property is also seen as this massive incentive to labor. Thinkers from Aristotle onwards, including utilitarian and economic theorists, argued that the possibility of acquiring private property encourages hard work, skill development, and, crucially, efficient resource allocation through market competition. The underlying belief here is that humans are, self-seeking, and work is instrumental, a means to an end, driven by the desire for material consumption. Without the prospect of acquiring wealth, why would anyone bother?
Right. And this also ties into individual liberty, doesn't it? The idea that property ownership gives you independence and self-reliance. Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom famously took this even further, portraying private property as the most fundamental of civil liberties, suggesting that any government encroachment on it contains the seeds of totalitarian oppression. He saw it as a kind of bulwark against state power.
He absolutely did. And beyond liberty, private property is argued to offer profound social and personal benefits. Property owners tend to have a stake in society, promoting order and respect for the law. This is the idea behind advocating for a property-owning democracy. You see it in proposals like the American legal scholars Bruce Ackerman and Ann Allstott's idea for a one-time significant capital sum. I think it was around $80,000 given to young Americans upon reaching adulthood. It's a bold thought experiment designed to counteract the effects of inherited wealth and give everyone a real stake in society from the start. Plus, there's a deep psychological aspect. Property provides security and can be an exteriorization of an individual's personality. Think about how attached people are to their cars, houses, or books. That sense of personal violation during a burglary goes way beyond mere financial loss. It feels like an attack on your identity, on who you are.
That's a powerful point. But of course, private property hasn't been without its fierce critics, primarily from socialist thinkers. What's their core objection?
For socialists, private property, far from being a cornerstone of liberty, is seen as its fundamental threat. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon famously declared, "Property is theft," meaning the accumulation of wealth in private hands enables the rich to exploit the poor. Marxists take theft much more literally, seeing it as the extraction of surplus value from the proletariat's labor by the bourgeoisie, which leads directly to class oppression. That's why Marx and Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, called for the abolition of private property. It was central to their whole project.
And there's also a concern about how private property can distort human nature itself, breeding acquisitiveness and greed. I know traditional conservatives, maybe surprisingly, echo some of this, emphasizing custodianship for future generations. And green political theory, or even Buddhist economics, popularized by E.F. Schumacher in Small is Beautiful, advocate for ecological stewardship and right livelihood, promoting non-exploitative, sufficient production with ecological awareness rather than just endless consumption.
Right. Moving to common property, this is defined by McPherson as the right not to exclude others. It means shared access, often restricted to members of a collective, like a cooperative, a commune, or maybe a locality. Think of historical examples like Plato's philosopher kings, who were meant to own property in common to avoid corruption, or Thomas More's fictional Utopia.
Right. And the case for common property, usually made by socialists, communists, and communitarian anarchists, centers on the idea that labor is fundamentally a social activity. If wealth is produced collectively, it should be owned in common to promote the collective good, social cohesion, and solidarity. Plato, for instance, believed it would ensure rulers acted as a united, selfless whole.
Yet common property faces significant criticism. Opponents argue it can create a kind of depersonalized and insecure environment because individuals lack a private domain. More crucially, it can be inherently inefficient due to a lack of material incentive. Why work harder if you don't personally gain from it? This leads us straight to Garrett Hardin's famous concept, the tragedy of the commons. The counterintuitive insight here is that when resources are freely available to all, individual rationality can ironically lead to collective ruin. He explained how common land, with unrestricted access for grazing, was often overgrazed and became unproductive, harming everyone in the long run. It's a powerful lesson for everything from fishing grounds to, shared office refrigerators. If no one owns it or feels responsible, everyone might overuse it. This suggests that without private property or some kind of political authority to restrict access, common resources are prone to depletion.
So building on that, it's easy to confuse state property with common property. They're often thrown together with terms like public ownership or nationalization, making it seem like property is collectively owned by all citizens. But there's a crucial difference, Heywood highlights, isn't there?
There absolutely is. State property has this kind of dual nature. It's nominally owned by the people, like common property, but it's actually controlled by the government, much like private property. Citizens don't have an inherent right of access to, say, a police car or a government building, just as they don't to a private vehicle. The extent varies wildly, from basic state functions to entire industries, as seen in the Soviet Union's socialist state property, which encompassed pretty much all economic resources.
Arguments for state property often borrow from those common ownership justifications, like promoting collective social energy, cooperation, and cohesion. But it also has unique advantages, doesn't it? The state can control scarce resources, avoiding that tragedy of the commons for the community's interest, and maybe organize things more efficiently through planning.
It's exactly. However, state property has been heavily criticized. Advocates of common ownership argue it's not truly public, as workers can feel just as alienated as in private industry. It's frequently linked to centralization, bureaucracy, and inefficiency. Unwieldy planning systems can emerge, with officials becoming completely out of touch with economic needs or consumer wishes. There's also the danger that the state develops interests separate from the people, leading to what Milovan Djilas, a former Yugoslav communist official turned critic, termed a new class, a bureaucratic elite who effectively controlled and benefited from state property, much like capitalists do from private property.
Okay, so we've seen how property forms the very bedrock of economic organization, but how that property is allocated, bought, and sold brings us to the next massive player in economics, the market. It's born from the simple fact of scarcity. Human wants are, well, infinite, but resources aren't. We need a way to allocate those resources somehow.
Right. And in economic theory, a market isn't just a physical place you go to buy groceries. It's a system of commercial exchange where buyers and sellers connect. It's absolutely central to capitalism, allocating resources, determining production, and setting prices. The market's ascendancy since the late 20th century, aligning with economic globalization, has led to what's often called global capitalism.
And at the heart of the market is what Adam Smith famously called the invisible hand. It sounds almost mystical, doesn't it?
It does, but it's a really brilliant concept from his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations. Smith argued that market competition, driven by individual self-interest, unintentionally achieves broader social goals without any external control. It's as if an invisible hand guides economic life. This concept is built on the idea of perfect competition, where countless producers and consumers, supposedly with perfect information, are regulated by the price mechanism, the interaction of demand and supply. Prices fluctuate, sending signals to producers to step up output when demand rises, or fall when supply increases. It's meant to be a self-regulating dance.
So the implication is clear. Government should largely stay out of it. This is the idea of laissez-faire, letting the economy be entirely free. But most free market economists, even Smith himself, recognized a vital, albeit limited, role for government, right?
Absolutely. Government is crucial for providing a stable context, deterring external aggression, maintaining public order, enforcing contracts. It's the minimal or night watchman state idea. They also acknowledge government's role in policing the economy to prevent monopolies or cartels that restrict competition, and crucially, ensuring stable prices and sound money. The market needs a reliable means of exchange to function properly.
Okay. Despite the criticisms, there's no denying the market has been seen as a kind of miracle for wealth creation and innovation. What makes it so powerful in the eyes of its proponents?
Its primary attraction is indeed its ability to generate wealth through enterprise, innovation, and incredibly efficient resource use. The market acts as a sophisticated communication system, with price signals constantly transmitting messages. A rising price tells consumers to maybe buy less and producers to make more. Resources are irresistibly drawn to their most profitable use, leading towards what economists call Pareto efficiency, meaning you've allocated things so optimally that you can't make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. It's the economic equivalent of a perfectly balanced scale. This constant market discipline eradicates waste within firms, forcing them to keep costs down to compete. This is also why forms of market socialism have historically found it difficult to consistently respond to pure market dictates, as they often prioritize worker interests or social goals over pure profit maximization.
And I suppose that's why we see such an incredible array of products in market economies, isn't it? That direct link to consumer choice must be incredibly powerful.
It is. Consumer sovereignty means your purchase decisions are like votes in a democratic mechanism, driving technological innovation and progress. From a moral and political standpoint, the market is justified utilitarily because it allows individuals to satisfy their own desires, upholding individual liberty and freedom of choice in what to buy or where to work. It's also argued that the market promotes a kind of equality. It's no respecter of persons, rewarding merit, talent, and hard work, supposedly ignoring race, gender, or religion. Some even argue it strengthens moral standards, as reliability, integrity, and trust are essential for successful commercial transactions.
Right. But for all its successes, the market has severe criticisms and significant flaws. Even Marx and Engels acknowledged its technological progress, but they also saw it as fundamentally flawed and exploitative. What are some of the biggest cracks in the market's facade?
That's right. And the idea of a pure market system is largely a myth anyway. Government intervention has been a constant, especially in the capitalist West throughout the 20th century. Welfare states emerged. Governments managed economies through fiscal and monetary policies, and nationalization became common. Even after the free market reversal since the 1980s, the minimal state hasn't really been resurrected.
And we often hear about market failures, situations where the market just doesn't work as advertised. Can you give us some key examples?
Precisely. One major failure is externalities or social costs, like pollution. These are costs that affect society but aren't reflected in a firm's balance sheet, so the market, left alone, allows them to continue. Only government intervention through prohibition or maybe a polluter pays principle can address them effectively. Then there are public goods, things beneficial to all, but from which it's hard to exclude non-paying users, like lighthouses or national defense. This leads to free riders, so the market won't provide them efficiently, requiring government provision. And this argument can be extended to things like public health, transport, and education.
You've highlighted the beauty of market competition, but isn't there an inherent paradox? Doesn't the very drive for profit and efficiency sometimes lead to consolidation, where a few big players swallow up the rest, ultimately stifling the competition it supposedly champions?
That's a crucial point. The internal logic can indeed lead to monopolies, cartels, and restricted consumer choice. And advertising can manipulate desires, making that idea of consumer sovereignty something of an illusion, as the economist J.K. Galbraith warned. Furthermore, markets respond to effective demand, which is just a fancy way of saying the ability to pay, not necessarily genuine human needs. So a person might desperately need food, but if they lack the money, the market won't necessarily produce it for them, or at least not at a price they can afford. Resources can be devoted to luxuries for the rich, while basic necessities for the poor remain unmet because the poor simply lack market power.
And famously, John Maynard Keynes, during the Great Depression, pointed out that the market isn't always self-regulating. He challenged the very idea of automatic equilibrium.
He absolutely did. Keynes argued in the general theory that markets can spiral downwards into unemployment without self-correction, requiring government regulation through demand management. The market, left entirely to itself, might not always find its way back to full employment equilibrium, leading to prolonged economic hardship. Ultimately, the moral and political case against the market often centers on its potentially destructive effect on social values, promoting selfishness and creating atomized individuals. It's also linked to deep social inequality, with rewards based on market value, not necessarily social benefit, and heavily influenced by factors like inheritance and background, making it far from a level playing field.
Okay, so if the market has its flaws, the key alternative that's been explored historically is planning. This is defined as the rational organization of economic life. It's about setting clear, purposeful goals and believing that human reason can actually solve the problem of scarcity.
Exactly. The idea of planning has a strong historical association with socialist economics and Marxism, though Marx himself didn't really give a detailed blueprint for a future socialist society. He emphasized collective ownership to meet human needs, assuming abundance would follow. In practice, we see directive planning, or a command economy like the Soviet model under Stalin, where Gosplan and state institutions set output and input decisions for virtually everything. It's very top-down. This stands in contrast to indicative planning, which became common in Western approaches after World War II. Here, planning supplements the market, influencing it indirectly through targets or guidance. Think of post-war France, the Netherlands, or even Japan's powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MIT, which famously guided investment and identified key growth industries. India also adopted Soviet-influenced five-year plans, but without that same level of direct control over the private sector.
What's the promise of planning? Why would societies choose this path, believing it could be a better way to organize things?
Well, its attraction rests on the belief that economic problems are solvable by human ingenuity, placing the economy firmly in human hands, rather than leaving it to the seemingly chaotic forces of the market. Planners, relieved of the profit motive, can organize production for use, aiming to satisfy basic human needs like shelter, food, healthcare, and education directly. While Soviet-style central planning often struggled with consumer goods quality and variety, it was often successful, at least initially, in eradicating homelessness, unemployment, and absolute poverty by channeling resources and subsidizing basic necessities.
And planning can also lead to efficiency, at least in theory, by rational organization, avoiding the wastefulness sometimes seen in the market.
Yes, that's the argument. Just as capitalist firms meticulously plan their internal operations, Soviet planning attempted to transfer this rational control to the entire economy. It could avoid market irrationalities like mass unemployment, meaning human labor wouldn't lie idle while social needs went unmet. Planning also allows for focus on long-term strategic goals, like the Soviet Union's rapid buildup of heavy industries in the 1930s for national security, or Japan's strategic promotion of capital-intensive industries in the 1950s, even when they lacked comparative advantage at the time.
The political case for planning often emphasizes bringing the economy under democratic control, as opposed to market capitalism's accountability primarily to business owners and shareholders.
Precisely. Although central planning has been undeniably tainted by its association with authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union, indicative planning in democracies like France or Japan shows there's no necessary link between planning and authoritarianism. Economic decisions can be open to public scrutiny and democratic input. Finally, there's a strong moral case often made for planning. It aims to serve public or collective interests over purely selfish ones, fostering social solidarity and promoting egalitarianism. When combined with collective ownership, it can reduce structural inequalities and distribute rewards based on perceived social needs rather than just individual productivity or market value.
Despite those promises, though, planning has some serious, well-documented drawbacks. It never really stood completely alone, even in the Soviet Union, right? There were always cracks in the facade, market-like elements creeping in.
That's a crucial point. Even in the USSR, market impurities existed. Private consumption wasn't fully controlled. A labor market was tolerated. Those little peasant private plots were absolutely vital for food supply, and thriving black markets emerged for goods the official system simply failed to produce or distribute effectively. The central problems for planned economies, however, have consistently been economic inefficiency and low growth. Soviet growth declined drastically after the initial push in the 1950s, and this was a major factor in communism's eventual collapse. Friedrich Hayek famously critiqued central planning as inherently inefficient in The Road to Serfdom, arguing that the sheer range and complexity of information, like the estimated 12 million distinct products in the Soviet economy, was simply beyond the capacity of any central planners to handle effectively. Imagine trying to manage the production and distribution of every single screw, every loaf of bread, every piece of clothing for an entire nation from a single office. No matter how competent the planners, Hayek argued, central planning is basically doomed to inefficiency.
So, too much information, too many variables to track. What about incentives? Does planning fail to reward enterprise or hard work effectively?
It often does, yes. While egalitarian distribution is morally appealing to some, it doesn't necessarily promote efficiency. Centrally planned economies might achieve full employment, but they often suffered from high absenteeism, low productivity, and a significant lack of innovation. Workers might have jobs, but ensuring they worked efficiently or innovated was another matter entirely. Planning targets could also inadvertently bias the system toward low growth, as managers might deliberately underestimate their capacity to get more achievable targets, and planners themselves might set modest goals to ensure successful completion of the plan, rather than striving for ambitious leaps forward. And finally, planning has faced severe political and moral criticisms. It's frequently linked to the growth of massive bureaucracies, privilege, and corruption. Without the discipline of market competition, planners can impose their preferences from above, leading to what some called a tyranny of the planners. Lenin Gillis, whom I mentioned earlier, famously called the sprawling Soviet state bureaucracy a new class, enjoying privileges very similar to capitalists. And Hayek's fiercest attack, of course, connected central planning, exemplified by Gosplan, directly to totalitarian oppression and the gulags, arguing that once economic life is fully regulated by the state, all other aspects of human existence inevitably fall under state control too.
This deep dive really shows us that the choice between different property models, market mechanisms, and planning isn't just some abstract theoretical debate. It's a deeply practical and ongoing challenge, shaping the very societies we live in and influencing our daily lives in countless ways, from our personal possessions right up to global trade.
And for you to consider, while history offers us stark examples of successes and failures for each of these approaches, how do societies, including our own, continually attempt to blend or navigate these often conflicting principles to achieve shared prosperity and social justice? Is there an optimal balance, or is a search for it perhaps an eternal political challenge?